Letter 3 of Pomona's Travels, a series of letters to the Mistress of Rudder Grange from her former handmaiden, by Frank R. Stockton. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Letter number 3. Jone overshadows the waiter. London. At dinner time the day when I had the conversation with Jone mentioned in my last letter, we was sitting in the dining room at a little table in a far corner, where we'd never been before. Not being considered of any importance, they put us sometimes in one place and sometimes in another, instead of giving us regular seats, as I noticed most of the other people had, and I was looking around to see if anybody was ever going to come and wait on us, when suddenly I heard an awful noise. I have read about the rumblings of earthquakes, and although I had never heard any of them, I have felt the shock, and I can imagine the awfulness of the rumbling, and I had a feeling as if the building was about to sway and swing as they do in earthquakes. It wasn't all my imagining, for I saw the people at the other tables near us jump, and two waiters who was hurrying past stopped short as if they had been jerked up by a curb bit. I turned to look at Jone, but he was sitting up straight in his chair, as solemn and as steadfast as a gate-post, and I thought to myself that if he hadn't heard anything he must have been struck deaf, and I was just on the point of jumping up and shouting to him, "Fly, before the walls and roof come down upon us," when that awful noise occurred again. My blood stood frigid in my veins, and as I started back I saw before me a waiter, his face ashy pale and his knees bending beneath him. Some people near us were half getting up from their chairs, and I pushed back and looked at Jone again, who had not moved except that his mouth was open. Then I knew what it was that I thought was an earthquake. It was Jone giving an order to the waiter. I bit my lips and sat silent. The people around kept looking at us, and the poor man who was receiving the shock stood trembling like a leaf. When the volcanic disturbance, so to speak, was over, the waiter bowed himself as if he had been a heathen in a temple, and gasping, "Yes, sir, immediate," glided unevenly away. He hadn't waited on us before, and little thought, when he was going to stride proudly past our table, what a double-loaded Vesuvius was sitting in Jone's chair. I leaned over the table and said to Jone that if he would stick to that we could rent a bishopric if we wanted to, and I was so proud I could have patted him on the back. Well, after that we had no more trouble about being waited on, for that waiter of ours went about as if he had his neck bared for the fatal stroke, and Jone was holding the scimitar. The head waiter came to us before we was done dinner, and asked if we had everything we wanted, and if that table suited us, because if it did we could always have it. To which Jone distantly thundered that if he would see that it always had a clean tablecloth it would do well enough. Even the man who stood at the big table in the middle of the room and carved the cold meats, with his hair parted in the middle, and who looked as if he were saying to himself, as with a bland dexterity and tastefulness he laid each slice upon its plate, "Now, then, the socialistic movement in Paris is arrested for the time being, and here again I put an end to the hopes of Russia getting to the sea through Afghanistan, and now I carefully spread contentment over the minds of all them riotous Welsh miners." Even he turned around and bowed to us as we passed him, and once sent a waiter to ask if we'd like a little bit of potted beef, which was particularly good that day. Jone kept up his rumblings, though they sounded more distant and more deep underground, and one day at luncheon an elderly woman, who was sitting alone at a table near us, turned to me and spoke. She was a very plain person, with her face all seamed and rough with exposure to the weather, like as if she had been captain to a pilot boat, and with a general appearance of being a cook with good recommendations, but at present out of a place. I might have wondered at such a person being at such a hotel, but remembering what I had been myself, I couldn't say what mightn't have happened to other people. "I'm glad to see," said she, "that you sent away that mutton, for if more persons would object to things that are not properly cooked, we'd all be better served. I suppose that in your country most people are so rich that they can afford to have the best of everything, and have it always. I fancy the great wealth of American citizens must make their housekeeping very different from ours." Now, I must say I began to bristle at being spoken to like that. I'm as proud of being an American as anybody can be, but I don't like the home of the free thrown into my teeth every time I open my mouth. There's no knowing what money Jone and I have lost through giving orders to London cabmen in what is called our American accent. The minute we tell the driver of a hansom where we want to go, that place doubles its distance from the spot we start from. Now I think the great reason Jone's rumbling worked so well was that it had in it a sort of great British chest sound, as if his lungs was rusty. The waiter had heard that before and knew what it meant. If he had spoken out in the clear American fashion, I expect his voice would have gone clear through the waiter without his knowing it, like the person in the story, whose neck was sliced through, and who didn't know it until he had sneezed and his head fell off. "Yes, ma'am," I said, answering her with as much of a wearied feeling as I could put on. "Our wealth is all very well in some ways, but it is a dreadful wearing on us. However, we try to bear up under it and be content." "Well," said she, "contentment is a great blessing in every station, though I have never tried it in yours. Do you expect to make a long stay in London?" As she seemed like a civil and well-meaning woman, and was the first person who had spoken to us in a social way, I didn't mind talking to her, and told her we was only stopping in London until we could find the kind of country house we wanted, and when she asked what kind it was, I described what we wanted and how we was still answering advertisements and going to see agents, who was always recommended exactly the kind of house we did not care for. "Vicarages are all very well," said she, "but it sometimes happened, and has happened to friends of mine, that when a vicar has let his house he makes up his mind not to waste his money in travelling, and he takes lodgings near by and keeps an eternal eye upon his tenants. I don't believe any independent American would fancy that." "No, indeed," said I, and then she went on to say that if we wanted a small country house for a month or two, she knew of one which she believed would suit us, and it wasn't a vicarage either. When I asked her to tell me about it, she brought her chair up to our table, together with her mug of beer, her bread and cheese, and she went into the particulars about the house she knew of. "It is situated," said she, "in the west of England, in the most beautiful part of our country. It is near one of the quaintest little villages that the past ages have left us, and not far away are the beautiful waters of the Bristol Channel, with the mountains of Wales rising against the sky on the horizon, and all about are hills and valleys, and woods and beautiful moors and babbling streams, with all the loveliness of cultivated rurality merging into the wild beauties of unadorned nature." If these was not exactly her words, they expressed the ideas she roused in my mind. She said the place was far enough away from the railways and the steam of travel, and among the simple peasantry, and that in the society of the resident gentry we would see English country life as it is, uncontaminated by the tourist or the commercial traveller. I can't remember all the things she said about this charming cottage, in this most supremely beautiful spot, but I sat and listened, and the description held me spellbound as a snake fascinates a frog, with this difference, instead of being swallowed by the description, I swallowed it. When the old woman had given us the address of the person who had the letting of the cottage, and Jone and me had gone to our own room, I said to him, before we had time to sit down, "What do you think?" "I think," said he, "that we ought to follow that old woman's advice and go look at this house." "Go and look at it!" I exclaimed. "Not a bit of it. If we do that, we are bound to see something or hear something that will make us hesitate and consider, and if we do that, away goes our enthusiasm and our rapture. I say, telegraph this minute, and say we'll take the house, and send a letter by the next mail with a postal order in it, to secure the place." Jone looked at me hard, and said he'd feel easier in his mind if he understood what I was talking about. "Never mind understanding," said I. "Go down and telegraph we'll take the house. There isn't a minute to lose." "But," said Jone, "if we find out when we get there—" "Never mind that," said I. "If we find out when we get there it isn't all we thought it was, and we're bound to do that, we'll make the best of what doesn't suit us because it can't be helped. But if we go and look at it, it's 10 to 1 we won't take it." "How long are we to take it for?" said Jone. "A month anyway, and perhaps longer," I told him, giving a push toward the door. "All right," said he, and he went and telegraphed. I believe if Jone was told he could go anywhere and stay for a month, he'd choose that place from among all the most enchanting spots on the earth where he couldn't stay so long. As for me, the one thing that held me was the romanticness of the place. From what the old woman said, I knew there couldn't be any mistake about that, and if I could find myself the mistress of a romantic cottage near an ancient village of the olden time, I would put up with most everything except dirt, and as dirt and me seldom keeps company very long, even that can't frighten me. When I saw the old woman at luncheon the next day, and told her what we had done, she was fairly dumbfounded. "Really, really," said she, "you Americans are the speediest people I ever did see. Why, an English person would have taken a week to consider that place before taking it." "And lost it 10 to 1, said I. She shook her head. "Well," said she, "I suppose it's on account of your habits, and you can't help it, but it's a poor way of doing business." Now I began to think from this that her conscience was beginning to trouble her for having given so fairy-like a picture of the house, and as I was afraid she might think it her duty to bring up some disadvantages, I changed the conversation and got away as soon as I could. When we once got seated at our humble board in our rural cot I wouldn't be afraid of any bugaboos, but I didn't want them brought up then. I can generally depend upon Jone, but sometimes he gets a little stubborn. We didn't see this old person any more, and when I asked the waiter about her the next day, he said she was sure she had left the hotel, by which I suppose he must have meant he'd got his half-crown. Her fading away in this fashion made it all seem like a myth or a phantasm, but when the next morning we got a receipt for the money Jone sent, and a note saying the house was ready for our reception, I felt myself on solid ground again, and tomorrow we start, bag and baggage, for Chedcombe, which is the name of the village where the house is that we have taken. I'll write to you, madam, as soon as we get there, and I hope with all my heart and soul that when we see what's wrong with it, and there's bound to be something, that it may not be anything bad enough to make us give it up and go floating off in voidness, like a spider-web blown before a summer breeze, without knowing what's going to run up against and stick to, and, what is more, probably lose the money we paid in advance. End of Letter 3. Read by Sibella Denton. All LibriVox files are in the public domain. For more information, please visit LibriVox.org.